When we think about race today, whether we affirm its existence and are race realists or deny its existence and are race anti-realists, we tend to think about it in bottom-up terms. Race realists explain the existence of racial categories by saying there are identifiable, distinct genetic clusters because they share ancestry that goes back to geographically distinct and relatively homogeneous breeding populations. Race anti-realists explain the existence of our categorical scheme by saying it is a heuristic device invented to serve the interests of power. Someone found it expedient to arbitrarily divide up humanity in this way and devise these labels. What race anti-realists miss is that there has to be some kind of correspondence between a heuristic and the structure of underlying reality if that heuristic is going to be useful. You do actually have to track real patterns in nature when you invent some kind of linguistic instrument to serve your interests. It's a similar problem to what anti-essentialists deal with in mathematics. If you say that math is just a tool that we use to achieve our ends, well, why does that tool work, right? When you make a tool to do something, that tool has to conform to the structure of the underlying world on which you want to employ that tool. The way that we can invent tools is constrained by the structure of underlying reality. Tools have to track reality, otherwise they won't function. So if power wants to devise some kind of label like this, the label better track some kind of real ontological division. What the race realists miss is subtler. They tend to look at the existing racial types as the output of a process. So in a way, existing racial types are happenstance. If things had gone differently, any number of different racial characteristics could exist today. But before that evolutionary process got going, the laws of nature already constrained what was possible evolutionarily and what was impossible. We can say true things about what is possible evolutionarily and what is impossible evolutionarily. We could talk about a potential future race of humanity that is 9 feet tall on average. Those people would have to have certain morphological characteristics in order for them to be mechanically possible as life forms. So we can say a lot of true things about this potential future race. We can say a lot of false things about that potential future race. How is that possible unless there is some kind of ontological status to that potential future? If we admit in the first place that there is a difference between possible and impossible futures, we're saying that there is a reality to possibility in some sense. We're giving it an ontological status. And we really need that ontological status in order to make sense of the truth claims we make about those potential futures. According to the basic correspondence theory of truth, a proposition is true if it corresponds to the nature of its object of reference. A proposition has to have a referent in order to be true. It has to be true about something. So we're talking about potential futures, and we come up with true and false propositions. If those are to be truly true and truly false, then the object of reference has to be real. And so those potentials have to be actual in some sense. They can't be purely potential. They have to have an ontological status. That means before evolution gets started, there is this field of potentiality that is structured, right? You don't get the diversity of life forms purely procedurally, because the logic of evolution, the logic of the cosmos, already lays out pathways of possible development and excludes other pathways of development. So rather than particular species, particular races being generated purely, we have to admit that they have some kind of eternal existence as structures of probability. You can also think of this in terms of the many worlds interpretation. This business about there needing to be reference for propositions about potential futures is the same reasoning that David Lewis uses for counterfactual realism. He argues for a multiverse by saying that we can say things, true things, about counterfactual scenarios, not potential futures, but, parallel presents that we're not in, but which could have existed had events gone differently. So we can say truly that if Johnny had made that last basket, his team would have won the game. If that sentence is going to be truly true, the object of reference, once again, has to be real. And therefore, all of those parallel worlds have to be real in some sense. Now, you can here decide that there's an ontological distinction between true potentials and true actualities. We're in an actual world. There are structured, really existing potential worlds, but they have like a murkier form of existence or something. I don't get that move. To me, it seems like if something is potential, that's a relative statement. Something is potential because we're not currently actualizing it, but in its own frame of reference, it must be actual. So if that's the case, then these structures of probability, possibility, are really just coherent, kind of crystalline, formal structures distributed interdimensionally. There are these crystals in the multiverse that define coherent sets of attributes that particular life forms could have. And there are developments in evolutionary theory along these lines. Günter Beckley, a German paleontologist, has argued from the timing of large-scale morphological changes in the archaeological record for a kind of directed evolution. So not random mutation and selection, but computed mutation and selection. Specifically, quantum computational processes would have to be involved in DNA itself. We imagine mutation as a random process, but that hasn't been confirmed experimentally. We know that DNA itself is held together through quantum superposition, through entanglement. The way that quantum computation works, according to David Deutsch, the inventor of the concept, is that it employs the resources of the corresponding computational device in parallel worlds. So typically, quantum computation is used to factorize large numbers. So a classical computer has to look at every possibility in sequence. The quantum computer instead looks at all of the possibilities in parallel, because it has this infinite number of parallel worlds to tap into, by virtue of the mechanism existing in superposition. That's why quantum computers are so hard to make. You have to have causally isolated, like CPUs in a way. It has to be very, very cold and stuff like that. So if somehow DNA is doing a similar thing, it makes sense that this DNA molecule in superposition would exist with respect to a kind of smeared out range of possible contexts in which it would find itself. And it, through all of the parallel instances of itself where that superposition state is distributed, it can kind of feel out the timelines in which a given mutation will survive and the timelines where a given mutation will not survive. So if it's going to mutate in either direction A or direction B, and there are 999 branching timelines in which mutation A works, leads to like surviving offspring, then and only one timeline in which mutation B is coherent and lives, then this quantum computational process will lead to the mutation A. Not randomly, but as a result of quantum computation. Another way of looking at that is that there are definite attractor states in the probability space of evolution. And naturally, we will gravitate towards those attractor states. There are many implications of this. One ethical implication, which I'm not endorsing, I'm just simply stating it, is that it may be the case that it is not a good idea to engage in mixing of very different genetic profiles, because then you're kind of undermining the ability of this quantum computational process to refine a particular coherent type to reach that attractor state. There's no guarantee that any random set of attributes is going to constitute one of these attractor states. There may be a mechanism, this guided evolution, that would lead us towards attractor states naturally if we mix up the kinds that exist now irresponsibly. Then we may not be reaching stable structures. And note also that this process is not just looking at what individual traits individual organisms could have. It's looking at like conforming the organism to coherent possible ecologies. And, that involves the modern world with its technology and everything too. This process in kind of looking out ahead at what mutational structures would survive and what would not, it's looking out into our technological future as well. So if we're tuned into this process and being guided by these true kinds, then this is already accounting for existential threats to humanity in a certain regard. Because basically we are calculating towards the structure of our being that's going to be coherent and stable. So that's very holistic, and we can't replicate that by discursive reason and problem solving cognitively. Also any random set of attributes is not going to necessarily occur together in nature. You take a bunch of really cold adapted attributes and mix that with really hot adapted attributes. The resulting offspring may not conform very closely to one of those crystalline structures in the multiverse, these kind of root races, which means that ultimately that life form is going to have a lower chance of survival and a lesser form of reality in some sense. If Plato is right and what is formal is what is actual and real, and what is, more material and doesn't conform to the true kinds in nature, that has a weaker form of existence, which is just kind of statistically true. If the structure of these crystalline things is the probability structure, then conforming to that means you have greater reality, at least from an evolutionary perspective. So that's one implication. Yeah. There are some other kind of out there implications of this. One would be that it is not necessarily the case that all mixes of all distinct types would not approach one of these attractor states. Because even though there hasn't been an ecology on Earth that has selected for exactly the attributes that like Hapa, English, Japanese people have on average, maybe in the multiverse somewhere there is like a planet with an island civilization of the Hapa, English, Japanese race. And so when we engage in that mixing here, in effect, we are summoning that root race into our plane of existence. Not any random mix, though, would reach one of these attractor states. So I know this is a kind of odd concept. Someone was asking, about the root races, about spiritual race and what that means. I'm kind of talking about the physical aspect of it now, even though I'm talking about it in terms of the multiverse. But of course, corresponding with each of these physiological types would be a psychological type. There is a correspondence between the structure of our physicality and the structure of our mentality. There has to be. So, what are the characteristics of the mentality of an individual who's closer to the core of that root race? Someone who is within that crystalline, organized, coherent structure. Will their mentality be disposed towards the formal? Will the mentality of those who deviate furthest from those crystalline archetypes, will they be more material in their thought and less formal? I'm not endorsing any ethical views as a result of this. It's just actually how I think evolution works and how races actually work. So, let me know what you think about it. Give criticisms if you can. Let me know if the idea is clear. There are a ton of implications of this if taken seriously. It draws on some very novel, as yet unpublished evolutionary theory. So we can test some of this stuff going forward. But I think the philosophical arguments are pretty clear. Why we have to accept the existence of these kind of predefined probability structures. If we're going to accept that the laws of physics exist, things like this, then, and if we accept evolution exists, then evolution moves towards these attractor states and may well be doing it intelligently, in a sense, in that it's doing it as a result of computation and not random mutation. So yeah, thank you guys for listening. God bless.